Okay, so what I'm hoping to do, everybody, is to go over the Unit 5 test with you today. Should be a fantastic test review. So, there are, the Unit 5 test is available for you now, and we can jump into that. So, everybody, focus, bring it back down so I don't have to take away the chat. Alrighty. Cool. Okay, so let's talk about the Unit 5. There was a lot of pretty interesting stuff that happened during this time period. We got the Vietnam War, we got the Cuban Missile Crisis, we got a whole bunch of cool stuff. We got big characters like Richard Nixon, Johnson, guys like that. So let's jump into them, see what we got going on. I want to start off with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, you guys studied this quite a bit during the section, so I'm not going to go too terribly deep into this, but I do want you to be able to answer a couple of questions, like what type of government did Cuba establish? You know, Fidel Castro got in charge and turned it communist, right? Why did the Soviet Union support Castro? Well, it had a lot to do with the Bay of Pigs. We tried to invade Cuba. Well, we sponsored an invasion in Cuba, and the Soviet Union said, hey, we don't like that. We're going to back you up, Cuba. So the Soviet Union decided to support Fidel Castro largely because of what we did, because of the Bay of Pigs. Why did President Kennedy initiate the naval blockade against the Soviet Union? Well, that should be pretty obvious. They were trying to establish a missile base there. How did the Cuban Missile Crisis end? We got rid of our missiles in Turkey. They got rid of their missiles in Cuba. Life was good, right? Back to being back to normally hating each other without weapons pointed at each other this time. So, or at least not too close. So anyways, you guys discussed the Cuban Missile Crisis quite a bit, so I'm going to let that one slide. Let's talk a little bit about Vietnam. Okay, during this time period, a lot of important things happened in Vietnam. First off, at the end of World War II, the Vietnamese people kick out the French. They are no longer under French rule. Military commander by the name of Ho Chi Minh was the leader of the Vietnamese people, and he was very much loved by the people. He led them through the Vietnam War and also helped them kick the French out. The people loved him. They called him Uncle Ho. He was communist, or at least he leaned towards communism as what he wanted to establish for the government. So even though the people loved him, we did not, or at least the American people at the time opposed his ability to rule. So the people loved him. They called him Uncle Ho. You know, and that he looks like a nice guy too. He's good old Uncle Ho. He's a happy guy. So. Part of the reason why we decided to get involved down in Vietnam was this idea of the domino theory. We believed that if Vietnam fell, or one of these other countries fell to communism, then others would also fall. So we were afraid that if Vietnam went down, other countries like Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Burma, India, Bangladesh, all these other Southeast Asian countries would start to fall towards communism as well. And remember, our policy at the time was containment. We really wanted to contain communism, keep it from spreading to other countries. So keep an eye out for the domino theory, this idea that if one country falls, the others will fall as well. Now again, the goal was to contain communism, right? Well, we have this one leader established in South Vietnam, No Dinh Diem. That's how you pronounce his name, like no. Forget the G, it's a silent G. No Dinh Diem. He was the leader of the anti-communist government in South Vietnam, and we backed him. Okay, we established a relationship with him, mostly because he was anti-communist. Was he a nice guy? No, not really. He had some serious issues. He was a dictator. He stayed in power by ruling through force and fixing elections and things like that. So, should we really have? Who knows? You know, it's hard to say whether we did the right thing or not, but a lot of people protested the idea, especially the Vietnamese people. The people of South Vietnam spoke out very much against no, to the point where they were willing to immolate themselves. We talked about that, lighting themselves on fire in protest. After years of dealing with Diem's corrupt government, the U.S. authorized a coup d'etat. We authorized people to go in with our kind of big brother pat on the back and overthrow No's government. Diem was murdered without official U.S. consent, but who knows what was said. You know, you never really know with these kind of situations. But yeah, so we didn't like, we backed No because he was anti-communist. Even though most of the people liked Ho, Uncle Ho, we backed No instead. No for Ho. This doesn't really have anything to do with the Vietnam War, but I just think it's interesting that 3 weeks after No Diem was assassinated, President Kennedy was also assassinated. Lots of very difficult political decisions being made at this time, and difficult political decisions often create enemies. So we have a changing of the guard during this crisis, the Vietnam crisis at the time, not necessarily a war yet. Kennedy was assassinated, and President Johnson was sworn in as the new president and took the reins of this growing crisis in Vietnam. Becomes a Vietnam War throughout Johnson's presidency. Keep an eye out for General William Westmoreland. You'll need to know a little bit about him for the test. He was the U.S. commander in Vietnam. Some of the problems during the Vietnam War were the fact that there was very much a lack of a defined front. The U.S. forces, there wasn't really a line that said, okay, you cross that line and you're in the Viet Cong territory, you cross this line, you're in the U.S. It was very vague, so there was a lot of fighting in different areas. Sometimes they'd go in and clear an area, or so they thought, only to find out that Viet Cong have moved in right behind them and retaken the area. And so it was very much a back and forth, constant fighting on all grounds. There was really no safe place to rest. During the Vietnam War, the U.S. forces used chemical warfare. It was kind of the first time that we've ever resorted to chemical warfare. We would drop Agent Orange and napalm all over the jungle, the goal being to burn down the jungle so that to burn it down to the point where we can find the Vietnamese people, right? The Viet Cong fighters. They were hiding in the jungle, so we figured if we just burn down the jungle, then they won't be able to hide, right? It was a very, very terrible way to fight, actually. A lot of American soldiers were injured. A lot of them are suffering ill effects still today because we decided to use Agent Orange and napalm. They weren't very well tested and proven at that point. We decided to use them anyways. But, you know, war is ugly. There's no nice, sweet way to fight a war. So this is one of the things that happens during wartime. Alright, so what really brings us into the Vietnamese War? Well, one of the big reasons that we got started, and what Johnson used as a big justification for getting us into the Vietnam War, was an incident that happened in the Gulf of Tonkin. So shortly after Kennedy's assassination, there are a number of U.S. ships patrolling the waters off of the coast of Vietnam. They weren't necessarily authorized to be there by the Vietnamese people, by the Vietnamese governments. So there's it's a sticky situation. The USS Maddox claims that they were fired upon by a North Vietnamese torpedo boat. There are a couple of different conflicting reports still. There isn't really an official consensus on what happened, whether the Vietnamese boat fired first, whether we fired first, who knows. But what did happen from this, we know that boats were fired upon. One Vietnamese torpedo boat was sunk, as far as I remember. And what President Johnson did was he took this information to Congress and said, look, we've had an armed skirmish. Now the Vietnamese are firing upon us. It's time for us to escalate this situation. And it gave Johnson the ability to send troops without a formal declaration of war. Remember, the president has that capacity to send troops for a certain amount of time without Congress declaring war. So using the Gulf of Tonkin as kind of his flag, waving it in front of the American people saying, look, they're fighting us, we need to send troops over there, he gained some support to be able to send troops over there. So the Gulf of Tonkin, even though the details are a little bit fuzzy, we don't really know exactly who fired first and what really went on. Or at least at the time they didn't for sure. During the Vietnam War, now we talked a lot about this in the course, but I just want to recap some important parts of it. The Tet Offensive was a particularly important turning point in the war. It was a defeat of North Vietnamese forces. Well, what happened was North Vietnamese forces pushed all the way down into Saigon, which was a long, important push for them. This particular image you see is a very popular one of the time. These are people being evacuated from the American embassy in Saigon as the North Vietnamese troops push down through and take Saigon. Eventually, South Vietnamese troops and the U.S. still pushed the North Vietnamese back out of Saigon, but the damage had kind of been done at that point. This was a very big turning point when public opinion from this point goes south. It goes against the war. The Tet Offensive was a defeat for the North as far as military is concerned, but psychologically it was very much a victory for the North Vietnamese, because the American people from this point on turned very much against the war. And you can imagine, as I ask you in that question there on the screen, if you're at home and you see this image, knowing that these are American people being evacuated from Saigon as the North Vietnamese troops overrun the city, you know, what are you going to feel? It's time for us to get out of there, right? Why are we fighting this war? Why are we running? I mean, we're obviously not winning the war, so let's just get out of it. A lot of people started to think that this should be the end of this Vietnamese war, and so a lot of public opinion turned against Vietnam thanks to the Vietnam War, thanks to the Tet Offensive. So here's a quick recap of events happening in Vietnam. You can see 5 presidencies. 5 presidencies are involved with the Vietnam conflict, which eventually became the Vietnam War. Eisenhower was the first. He sent military advisors to South Vietnam to help train the regime's army and help again stop Vietnam from turning completely communist and hopefully put a stop to the domino effect that was Eisenhower's goal. Kennedy later sends 3,000 military advisors and helicopters and American pilots to South Vietnam. And at this point, again, still it's not a war, and we're still limited. You see, all they're sending are advisors, quote-unquote advisors. It was really during Johnson's presidency and the Tonkin Resolution, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, that we begin to fight in this full-on, full-scale war. The Tet Offensive happens. Majority of Americans opposed the war. During Nixon's presidency, Nixon announces what he called a Vietnamization plan. The Vietnamization plan was kind of similar to what we've done in Iraq recently, was to try to turn the conflict back over to native forces and get ourselves out of it. So, question, do pilots constitute a part of the Air Force, which is part of the military? Yes. Technically, yes, American pilots, but they were sent there to train. That's a good question, Jordan. Kennedy sent people there, advisors and pilots, to train other people, not necessarily to fight the war. It wasn't until Johnson that they were ordered pretty much to engage. So, And during Gerald Ford's presidency, after Nixon resigns, which we'll talk about a little bit later, despite a negotiated peace in Vietnam, Saigon City itself still falls to the Viet Cong. So it didn't seem to matter much. We fought this really long, really drawn out war where we lost a lot of our own men, not to mention a lot of Vietnamese people, and we didn't really win anything. We didn't really gain anything. So there was a lot of opposition for the war. So yeah, a lot of opposition for the war. So let's talk a little bit about some of the major events in opposition to the war. Some of the concerns for those who opposed the war. Number one, of course, was civilian deaths, was that there were a lot of Vietnamese people who were not involved in the fighting, but were still dying. There were a lot of civilians being killed. I mean, when you go through and napalm an entire section of the jungle, you don't know who's in it, right? And so there were a lot of villages that we just plain wiped out. There were a lot of villages that the Viet Cong wiped out. It was a very high attrition rate. Lots of civilians were killed. Another concern was a lot of people said that we didn't really need to be there, that this was a civil war between the Vietnamese people. Why were the Americans involved at all, right? It was really a war between the North Vietnamese, who wanted their country to be united communist, and the South Vietnamese, who wanted their country to be united as a democratic country. So why were we even involved at all? It was basically a civil war that we got involved in, and so a lot of people believed that we didn't need to be there. Some other concerns by those who opposed the war were the fact that the draft, drafting American soldiers to go fight in the war, seemed to target the poor and working class. There were some loopholes that allowed some relatively well-off people to get out of fighting, to dodge the draft, basically. And so a lot of people felt that we were sending our poor and working class over to die for no reason. Because of this, there were a number of different protests and movements. One of the most violent was the Kent State University protest. Started off as a very quiet university student protest. They got a little pushy. The National Guard was sent in, a little bit more pushing on both sides, and then eventually there were shots fired, and I believe 9 students were killed during this. The National Guard ended up killing 9 protesters, 9 students. Not necessarily peaceful, like I said. They were, but the students were unarmed. That's important to know. There was violence at a Democratic National Convention. There were marches on Washington. A couple of things that you need to take a look at in preparation for your test. There were some really important people who opposed the war, Jane Fonda being one of them. She was a big movie star at the time, and she was very vocal about opposing the war. Dr. Benjamin Spock, not Dr. Spock from, not Mr. Spock, but Dr. Spock. Dr. Benjamin Spock, he wrote an important book that you guys read about for the baby boomers. His book on parenting was very important at the time, so he gained a lot of influence, and so his notable opposition was noteworthy. That makes sense. Senator William Fulbright was very vocal against opposing the war. So yeah. Jordan also asked another good question. Wouldn't the protests count as free speech? Absolutely. Yeah, the protests, there were tons and tons, thousands and thousands of protests during this time period. I'll show you pictures of a few more of them. And most of them were very nonviolent and no real issues. But this one in particular at Kent State escalated to violence, and it was pretty difficult for the American people to swallow. Now the National Guard were firing on U.S. citizens in opposition to the war, so it became a very tough situation. Oh yeah, I repeated that part. Notables who opposed the war. Well, they were notable. One more reason why people started to turn against the war, President Nixon, when he took over, there was a sensitive area on the border of Vietnam and Cambodia, and there was some government changeover in Cambodia, so Nixon felt like it was a really good opportunity to go in and wipe out the Viet Cong along the border and hopefully shore up the defenses of Cambodia, as well as help prove a little bit more, prove to be a little bit more good in Vietnam. Now, the problem was it turned into a huge public relations backfire. He was hoping to gain a little more support and show that we were now protecting Cambodia from the communists, but as the bombs fell, more people were injured, more civilians were injured, and the American people went even further and further in opposition to the Vietnam War, because now it was spreading into Cambodia and harming more innocents there. So yeah, it was a pretty big backfire. As far as, I mean, they did capture a number of areas, so militaristically it was a very important move, but as far as public opinion goes, there was a big backfire, big opposition. So again, you can see, just like the Tet Offensive, it doesn't seem to matter whether we were winning the war militaristically. Everything we did seemed to make the American people more angry at the war and wanted us to be out. So it was a difficult situation for some of these political leaders to be in. You know, that we're in a war and we have to fight and protect our troops now and protect the people we've sworn to protect, but the American people keep turning against the war and everything they do. So it was a very tough spot for things to be in. A lot of tension during this time period. If any of you have seen Forrest Gump, you know, there's a whole bunch of Forrest Gump dedicated to this time period where it was a tough time. A lot of peace movements, a lot of students banding together, the Students for Democratic Society. College students are pretty, it's pretty common to see protests and things like that come out of college students. You'll see throughout history, it's usually, if there's going to be a protest, it starts at a college somewhere. Free speech movement, Young Americans for Freedom, these are all college age groups that try to get together and reject the war. And they also start to reject the establishment and some traditional values, and they're starting to say, you know, all you politicians with your slick back hair and button up suits, you're all the same. We're going to go do something completely different because we don't believe what you believe. And so they start to reject the normal culture, and we have the rise of the hippie. So they lead many to reject, you know, the establishment itself, but some of them went pretty far and even rejected, you know, showers and living in a house and shaving and a couple of things like that, and, you know, wearing like underwear. Yeah, some of them went pretty far into this rejection of, you know, rejection of normal traditional cultures, right? Like, dude, don't let the man get you down. Don't wear underwear, man. That's what the man wears. You don't need underwear. You don't need to shave, dude. That's the man. That's the man getting you down. So yeah, and a lot of drugs for sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. Where'd they get the name hippie? That's a good point. I don't know. Because they were hip, you know, they're trying to be hip and cool, maybe. I don't know. I'll have to research that a little bit. I never thought about that before. It's a good question. A hippie. Where'd that term come from? But yeah, the whole take a shower hippie comes from this time period because, again, they're rejecting the establishment and traditional values all the way to the point where they're like, you know what, I'm not going to shower anymore. I'm going to live in the woods somewhere in a tent. I don't need a house. I just need a tent, and we're going to do drugs, and we're gonna not shower and forget all this buttoned up politicians and the corporate man from the 50s. That's not gonna happen to us, right? Yes, Rainbow Blossom Moonshine are people's names and things like that during the time. So yeah, rise of the hippie during this time period. Most of this the hippie movement came about as a rejection of the Vietnamese War and some of the things that were going on at the time. So let's talk a little about President Johnson. He played a large role in the Vietnamese War. He, of course, took over after Kennedy was assassinated. President Johnson, Arthur Schlesinger, which is a very important historian, he called Johnson's presidency the Imperial Presidency. What does that mean to you, the Imperial Presidency? How would President Johnson be considered to be an emperor? More of a monarchy than a presidency? Okay. He did, it was his way or the highway, as you can see here in the picture. This is what a lot of people at the time called the Johnson treatment. He would do this to people. He was a big dude. He was 6'6", I think, well over 250 pounds. He was from Texas, and he had a way of getting people to do what he wanted. We'll just leave it at that. He gave them the Johnson treatment. He would invade their personal space. I mean, he would get nose to nose with people and lean and tower over them until they really would just say whatever he wanted them to say, so he'd get out of their face. So Johnson had a way of getting people to do what he wanted, and the Johnson treatment started to spread, and he definitely did increase some of the executive powers. Right? He increased some of the power of the presidency, and this is why we call it the imperial presidency, because he gave more and more power to the office of the president during his time period, like declaring war on Vietnam without having Congress's approval. Right? He just kind of sent troops and did whatever he wanted to do. So he gave Congress the Johnson treatment at that point. So yeah, Johnson, he was an interesting dude. He was his presidency is fun to look at because he really expanded a lot of power, and a lot of it was based mostly just upon his powers of intimidation, not necessarily his powers of persuasion and politics. During this time period, we also see a lot of movements, a lot of protests to try to get equal rights here in the States. The second wave of feminism starts up during the late 60s and 70s. Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, really kicks off a huge storm of people trying to gain what's the word I'm looking for? Equality. There you go. It's the second wave of feminism, and they take it all the way to trying to get an amendment to the Constitution passed. So they're trying to get an amendment to the Constitution, the Equal Rights Amendment. The aim was to ban sexual discrimination based, and to entrench that into the Constitution. The amendment was written up, and it was passed by a number of different states, including Idaho. Whew. Wow, we were okay there. But it still failed to gain enough support to actually be added as an amendment. So you needed 2/3 of the states to be able to pass it to get an amendment into the Constitution, and it didn't quite reach 2/3. But they still made a lot of improvements and gained a lot of ground, this particular movement, and helped a lot, made a lot of difference towards creating equality here in the U.S., even if they didn't reach all of their stated goals. One of the effects of the movement was to increase the number of women enrolling in professional schools, and we can see that today. In fact, there are more women in college today than men. Over the last 10 years, the number of women enrolling in colleges, and especially going for bachelor's degrees and things like that, it's something in the country right now. It's something like 50 to 60% women and 40% men in colleges right now. So you can thank this second wave of feminism for starting that up. Some more civil rights issues of the time. African Americans were still looking for some civil rights, but as they get through the JFK and the 60s and things like that, there were other groups that started to see what happened with the African Americans, and they thought, okay, well, maybe we can try to get civil rights for our group too. Gays and lesbians, American Indians, Hispanics all started to say, well, if it worked for the blacks, let's we can do it too, right? Let's keep our comments back on track, please. Just going to go ahead. Those of you watching the recording, I'm recording a Class Connect session right now. Some folks are not necessarily commenting as I would hope, so I'm going to shut off the... There we go. Okay, so during this time period, there's also a large increase in the Hispanic population, people moving up from Mexico and Central America, and that also helps them gain a lot of political power. This guy in the bottom right here, Cesar Chavez, or Chavez, however you prefer to pronounce it, he became one of their leaders, and he formed the National Farm Workers Association. Okay, the National Farm Workers Association, NFWA, was to try to gain better treatment. It was basically a union for farm workers, and the majority of the farm workers at the time, as is today actually, were from Hispanic countries, so were Hispanic people. So he became pretty popular and pretty important in helping some of these movements keep going. Good old Cesar Chavez. Let's talk a little bit about President Nixon. We've gone into President Johnson a little bit. Let's talk about President Nixon. He's one of the big personalities of the era as well. During his presidency, he actually accomplished quite a bit. Right? We have some environmental achievements. The Environmental Protection Agency was set up under his presidency, which I think most people agree today has done some good things for the planet. Some people still think that it's not necessarily the right thing, but it's okay. I mean, they've done some good things, and everybody's entitled to their opinion. Set up 80,000 acres for national parks. They established the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency, which tracks tornadoes and things like that for us, helps us predict the weather quite a bit better than we used to be able to, so trying to keep some people safe that way. He also established a relationship with the Chinese, which hadn't happened since the Chinese had turned communist back in the late 40s. So we established a relationship with the Chinese, a political relationship. He thought a relationship with China would improve our relationship with the Soviet Union as well. This is during Nixon's time period. We start to practice what's called détente, or a loosening of tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. Nixon kind of started the process of diffusing the Cold War. Started to kind of help push the Cold War back, and eventually his successor Reagan, Carter and Reagan still work on getting it done, but it was kind of during Nixon's presidency that we see a lot of easing of tension, this détente between Soviet Union and the United States. But here's some things that weren't so good about President Nixon's presidency. I mean, he did some good things, obviously, but there were some things that didn't go so well. The Watergate scandal, I know you guys read quite a bit about that, but criminal activities were covered up by the president. He ordered a number of illegal wiretaps and things like that, and then tried to cover them all up. He believed that he used the term what he called executive privilege, meaning that certain communications as a president should be kept confidential, but most of the court rulings were against that idea, that a president is a public figure and therefore pretty much everything he does should be public, right? So there were a lot of issues. It eventually led to his impeachment, and again, impeachment is not necessarily an impeachment is a formal review. The word impeach means like a judgment. It's more like a trial. It's not necessarily him leaving office. He was impeached, yes, he went through the formal trial, but then he resigned. So he's the only president to have been impeached and resigned. We did impeach, technically President Clinton was impeached. He was put under formal review, but he did not resign. People became more skeptical of politics and less trusting of government after this particular affair, and we can see that happening in our day too, with certain wiretap laws and what the NSA is listening to and things like that. You can see how people felt back then by looking at some of the comments from what's going on today with NSA and things like that. Very similar feelings at the time. They felt betrayed by their president because he was doing things illegally and trying to say, well, I'm above the law. I am not a crook. I am not a crook, right? So Nixon kind of passes the torch on to Jimmy Carter, and things didn't go so well in the 70s either. The economy was a bit in the tank. We'd spent a lot of time fighting a war in Vietnam and things like that, and that always has a negative effect on your economy. Started to experience what became known as stagflation, stagnation in employment, stagnation in the economy. Economic growth is low, but inflation is going up. Inflation is when your dollar is worth less. Your dollar becomes worth less. Prices go up, but the amount of money you make doesn't go up. Things like that. So your dollar buys less. So they started to call this period in the 70s stagflation. It was kind of a flat time for the economy. The Arab nations get together and start to say, you know what? You want our oil? Well, we don't want to give it to you. So here you go. No fuel for you. So during the 70s, we start to see the rise of the ugliest cars ever made, because they were trying to be fuel efficient as opposed to our cool muscle cars of the 60s. Because of the cool muscle cars of the 60s, who used to use a ton of gas, in the 70s, the Arab countries that are producing oil won't let us have it, and so there isn't enough gas, and so we have to make these tiny little, Ford Pintos. You go from driving a cool Mustang to a Pinto? That's lame. But it all kind of had to do with the availability of fuel. And we've experienced that recently, you guys. In our economic downturn of 2007, oil prices went up, and fuel economy cars started to show up, like the Prius, and cars that aren't necessarily that attractive, but they're efficient, right? But nowadays we're starting to balance both. Do you know, like the new Ford Mustang, like a 2014 Mustang, gets like 30 miles to the gallon? That's awesome. That's better than my little 4-cylinder car that I'm driving now. So we finally figured out how to do both, how to have a car look good and how to have it not guzzle the fuel, right? I don't mean to say that a Prius is ugly. I'm sure some people like it, but it's not necessarily the most it's not winning many design awards. We'll just leave it at that. But it's very efficient. So, all right. That being said, so in the middle of this fuel crisis, President Carter is also focused on Iran, a hostage crisis in Iran. A bunch of students take over the Iranian embassy and take 66 Americans hostage and hold them there for a long, long time. This wasn't an overnight thing. This was months and months. In fact, it wasn't until the end of Carter's presidency and Reagan takes the reins that things were finally resolved. So it actually kind of led to President Carter's defeat because of his inability to solve or to fix the crisis. At least in the eyes of the American people, a lot of them believed that he was not capable of doing that. And so that's one of the reasons why he was not reelected and Reagan was. There were also a number of conflicts in Iran at the time, which we got involved in a little bit. We helped establish the Shah of Iran. There was a lot of conflict between the Ayatollahs, who were the holy men of the Iranian people, and the Shah, who was the actual leader, or like the king. The Shah is the king. The big question, though, was, should religion be part of the government? And that was a big defining factor of Iran back then. Eventually, the Shahs won out with a little help from us. We get by with a little help from our friends, and established some of the issues that we're also running in today in Iran. We've got a crazy guy in charge of Iran right now. So we've got some issues to deal with there as well. But the 70s, they weren't all bad, right? I mean, look at that great fashion from the 70s. We get groups like the Bee Gees, We totally couldn't have lived without the Bee Gees. And roller disco. So the 70s weren't all bad. there was some good things happening then too. So maybe, you know, people didn't have a whole lot of money and their money didn't buy much. Maybe that's why they had to start wearing grandma's clothes again, and, and just modify them in different ways. They pulled out grandpa's polyester orange suit and said, "Hey, this is cool. I can't afford a new suit, so I'll just you know, wear this instead." Now roller derby, disco, crazy fashion. Yeah, the 70s were a fun time. So all this stuff is going on overseas, and we're like, you know what? Let's just party. Let's get wild. Let's wear crazy clothes and sing with really high voices and do some disco. So that is your Unit 5 test review. If any of you have questions, feel free to stick around, but that's all the info you're going to need to be able to ace this test. Good luck on it. You're going to do well. Let me stop one of my recordings here.